Hi folks, welcome back to Tyson's Enduro Workshop. Sorry it's been a little while since we've posted anything up, but we've bought a house and moved workshops and a whole bunch of other stuff, so yeah, here's a new workshop. Lots bigger, nice concrete floor, slowly getting it set up. So yeah, that's why we haven't been doing much for a while. Today I'm going to do a video on replacing front wheel bearings. Last ride my front wheel was a little bit wobbly and a little bit grindy, a little bit of play in there, so we're going to have a quick go today at just whacking some new bearings in there. Should be a pretty quick one. Got the new bearings and some new seals over here, so I'll be whacking those in and we'll see how we go. Rightio, so first thing you want to do is just get your little axle spacers out of there, both sides obviously. Just using a flathead screwdriver for this, and then we'll just pop the old seals out. Sometimes you can reuse these, but generally it's not a good idea. They usually do wear a bit, so just replace them. They're pretty cheap. We'll chuck them out in the bin. Then we get down to the nitty gritty of the actual wheel bearings themselves. Oh, hope you can see that alright. Hang on, I'll lift that up a little bit. One thing that's worth noting, a lot of the time there's a spacer in the, well, there should always be a spacer in the middle here. In a lot of front wheels you can actually, if you wiggle it around, you'll actually find a spot where that spacer will move sideways a little bit, and that'll give you an edge on the far bearing to give you something to tap against. I know the trials bikes don't do that, and often one side will move more than the other, so just have a bit of a play with a screwdriver in there. You should be able to move that spacer around a bit. And you'll find a sweet spot where it'll actually move to one side a little bit. I don't know if you can actually see that in there, but it will give you a nice edge to tap against on that bearing with a drift. I actually can't remember on this wheel which side is the better one. Have a quick look. Just try and give that a bit of a shove. Yeah, it's moving pretty easily. And yeah, that should definitely give me something to tap the bearing out with. Okay, so the next thing I've done is just grabbed a couple of bits of wood here, spaced them out so I can sit the actual hub itself on top of them, just to give me a bit of space to knock the bearings down into. The next step is just to grab your trusty heat gun. Don't actually have to do this, but I find it works a lot better. Just heat up around the bearing a bit. Get that aluminium nice and warm, and it just makes the bearing come out a hell of a lot easier. I generally heat the hub to get the new bearings in a little bit too. You don't want it stupid hot, just nice and just beyond from what you can touch basically. So if it's just starting to sizzle your fingers when you touch it, that's about hot enough. You don't want to cook it. So anyway, I'll plug that in and we'll get into heating up the hub just a little bit and tap that bearing out. I'm not actually trying to heat the bearing itself, just put a bit of heat into the hub around the bearing. If you don't have a heat gun, this isn't strictly necessary, just takes a bit more force, but I always find it a good option. Alright, that might nearly be enough. We'll see how we go. Sit that back down in there. It might be a bit tricky for you guys to see this as such. Just going to use an appropriate drift and a hammer. And we'll sit that in there on that bit of a step if I can find it this time. Seeing in there myself. I need to get the lights in the shed sorted out. Yep. It's there, I think. wacko. One bearing out. Nice and easy, couple of gentle taps. There's the old bearing there. There's the spacer, we'll give all that a clean up. Second bearing's always a bit easier to get out because you've got a lot more access to it. So we'll just give that a quick warm up with the heat gun and see if we can get it out. Hope you can actually see what I'm doing here with that. I might switch that up a little bit. Just going around the outside of the bearing. Set that back down there. Let's see. A little drift again. Tap on one side. Oh, and pop straight out. One tap. All done. Okay, so I've just gone through and given everything a bit of a clean up with a bit of brake cleaner. Make sure the inside of these races is nice and clean, particularly the bottoms where the bearings are going to seat. Cleaned up the spacer a little bit too, so that's all good to go. I've got my new bearings here. These should be rubber sealed, so 2RS bearings. Generally in the past I've always popped off one side of these rubber seals and just ensured that the bearing is completely packed full of grease. A lot of the time you'll pop a bearing open and you'll find that they've only got the tiniest of dabs of grease in there, so generally I will pack them full of waterproof wheel bearing grease. These ones actually surprised me, the NSK bearings, and I popped the little seals off and they're actually really well packed with grease in there already. So I've just put the covers back on. I'm going to leave these as stock, but it is probably worthwhile just to pop the cover off. You can generally just get a little sharp pick and just put it in on the outside edge a little bit and just flick that cover up and off to have a look inside there. If they're not fully packed with grease, I would do that. Technically it's not correct usage of bearings, but these things are generally rated to 20,000 or 30,000 RPM. On a motorbike they're not doing anything like that, and I think being waterproof is a much better option, and being really well packed with grease is a good way to help ensure that. So I've never had any issues doing it. Some people will tell you not to do that, but in the past I've always done it without any issues, so something to think about anyway. Okay, so the next thing to do is just to go through your socket collection. Find a socket that's an appropriate size that will fit on this outside edge of the bearing itself. You don't want to put any force on the inside or on that seal at all. It has to be on the outside. And also make sure that that drops in and out of your wheel properly. There's nothing worse than knocking in a socket, or knocking in a bearing I should say, and then finding that your socket's jammed in there. So just ensure those two things. Generally, or basically all we're going to do is use that to help drift the bearing back into place and seat it properly. So yeah, they'll take a fair bit of abuse with a hammer, so don't be afraid to give them a tap. So that's pretty much the process. I'm just going to put a bit of heat back on the rim there first, and still got it sitting on the bits of wood, and then we should be able to get that bearing in there pretty nice and easily, I hope. So we'll put just a bit of heat on here again. Should be enough. I'm going to give it a quick spray with just a little bit of lubricant just to help that bearing slide in a bit easier. Try and do all this pretty quick. It's important to try and make sure that bearing goes in nice and square. As you can see, with a bit of heat, it's dropped in pretty much all the way. You'll actually hear it when it seats. The tone will change a bit. It looks like it's still a little bit further to go yet. Tones changed there. Pretty confident that's nice and seated now all the way around. Looks nice and even. Beautiful. So now we can just flick it over and do the other side. Same process. Make sure you don't forget to put your bearing spacer in there. Super important. That just drops in. A little bit of heat again on the hub itself. Little spray with a bit of lubricant. It's nearly empty. Can is empty now. No, well. Sit that bearing. You can see it basically pushes in nearly halfway. That's because of the heat. I've got my socket on top here. More to go by the looks. Not hitting this hard, just nice and gentle and just sort of trying to go around keeping everything nice and square. Again, you can hear that change in pitch when it seats. That's looking pretty good in there. More quick tap just to make sure. Side looks good. Nice and square. It's always good just to check the other side. Sometimes if it's a bit skew, if the spacer itself will actually push the bearing out the other side, which actually did happen in this case a little bit. One way to check is just to make sure that that spacer in the middle is firmly pinched between the bearings. That's pretty much it for the bearings. Just going to grab the front wheel axle now and just make sure that spacer is actually centered right. It's not quite centered there. Nudge. Axle's going through, and that spacer in the middle is firmly pinched. There's not much play in there at all, so that's a good way just to check that your bearings are seated properly. Okay, next thing to do is just to put the seals in. I'm going to use just the same socket that I used to push those bearings in. Seals generally go in a bit easier. Make sure that that side with the spring is on the inside and the sealed side is on the outside. I'm going to use a little bit of marine grease too. It's just waterproof wheel bearing grease. I'm just going to put a little bit of a smear of that in there on top of that bearing before I install the seal. Just helps to keep everything in there a little bit more watertight. Water is the main enemy of wheel bearings, so up here in the wet tropics we have a lot of creek crossings and riding a lot of mud, at least for half the year anyway, so our wheel bearings up here don't tend to last too long. So just a good little dab of grease all in through there. The other thing with these seals is to make sure, I won't do it at this point in time, but just to make sure that that groove inside the seal itself is well greased before you install the wheel. So, but yeah, I find it's a bit messy if you put the grease in there at this point in time. So just going to put a little bit of grease in there like that. And we'll sit the seal in on top. Actually, one thing I should actually probably do, on the GasGas, the wheel spaces themselves have a bit of a lip here. Sometimes they can be a bit of a pain in the ass to get in after the seal. So actually, no, we will go ahead and put some grease in that groove there. Make sure that's well and truly full of grease. Nice and greasy. I'll pop my wheel spacer through that. Like that. I just pushed out half the grease, but anyway. Put a bit more around the edges there. You can never have too much grease in an application like this. I find, at least, anyway. And then we might try and pop those seals in. A lot of the time you can just push these in by hand. That one's going in pretty well. If I'm lucky, I'll just use that socket and just push that in, make sure she's home all the way. Quick wipe with the rag, and there we go. One side all done. Do the same on the other side, and wheels ready to reinstall. So there we have it. Just on the other side there as well. New wheel bearings installed. Front wheels ready to go. I often get people asking me about this little bit of cloth here. It's just from my old BMX days. Tie a bit of cloth around your hub, it keeps it nice and clean in there. Bit of a pain in the ass spot to clean, and I don't think I've ever actually cleaned these hubs in there in my life. I just give it a quick pressure wash and make sure that cloth's clean after each ride, and looks a bit daggy, but I don't know, just what I do. Anyway, new wheel bearings are in, she's ready to go. Hopefully we'll get that back on the bike tonight, and all going well, we might get out for a ride tomorrow with some nice fresh wheel bearings and not have to worry about my front wheel falling apart. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope it's helpful. Please like and subscribe. Hopefully I'll get back into doing a few more videos now that I've moved and got the new workshop set up. Might take me a little bit to get back into the gist of doing all these videos again, but yeah, don't forget to hit the like button. Thanks, guys.